the photograph, she sits perfectly still. Her eyes are open. Her hands are positioned just so. There's only one problem. She's been dead for 3 days. Imagine this. There's a dusty old box tucked away in your great-great-grandmother's attic. Inside, carefully wrapped in silk ribbons, the color of old bone, are dozens of photographs. You pick one up. It's a family portrait. Mother, father, 3 small children, all dressed in their finest Sunday clothes. Everyone is staring directly at the camera with that unsettling stillness that only very old photographs seem to possess. But I want you to look closer. Look at the little girl standing in the center. Do you see how she's almost propped up between her 2 siblings? Notice how her eyes, even though they're open, have a strange, glassy quality to them. How her skin seems just a little too waxy, a little too perfect, a little too still. That's because she isn't sleeping. She isn't just resting. She's dead. And this photograph wasn't taken to celebrate a moment of life. It was taken to remember death. This is the strange, forgotten world of post-mortem photography. It was a practice so widespread in the 19th century that almost every family, from the richest to the poorest, participated in it. Yet, it is so completely forgotten today that most of us have no idea these haunting images might be hiding in our own family albums. For nearly a century, across America and Europe, an entire industry of photographers made their living from one very specific, very haunting specialty: making the dead look alive. They developed incredible, almost macabre techniques to achieve this. They would pose corpses in special stands and chairs, meticulously prop open their eyelids, and sometimes even paint pupils onto the closed eyelids of the developed prints. They arranged entire families around their deceased loved ones as if nothing was wrong, as if death was just another family member sitting down for a portrait. These weren't pictures of coffins or funerals. These were intimate, carefully staged scenes designed to preserve one final, fleeting moment of togetherness. They were meant to create the illusion that death was merely a deep sleep, that the person they loved hadn't really left them at all. Think about it. In an era before snapshots, before everyone had a camera in their pocket, photography was a monumental event. It was expensive and difficult. For many families, especially those who weren't wealthy, a person might live their entire life without ever having their picture taken. So, when a loved one died, especially a child, the post-mortem photograph was just a memento. It was often the only asterisk photograph the family would ever have of them. It was their only chance to capture a face they never wanted to forget. The most common subjects, heartbreakingly, were infants and young children. Child mortality rates in the 19th century were staggeringly high. Diseases we barely think about today, like diphtheria, scarlet fever, and measles, were death sentences. When a child died, the grief was immense, and the desire to hold on to their memory was overwhelming. Photographers had specialized props just for these situations. They had tiny chairs and cots. They would often pose the deceased child with their favorite toys, or nestled in their mother's arms, a style known as the mother with sleeping child pose. In these images, the mother gazes down at her child, her face a mask of sorrow, while the child appears to be peacefully asleep. It's an incredibly powerful and deeply sad image, capturing both the love and the loss in a single frame. They also used other family members to create a sense of life. Siblings would be posed holding their deceased brother or sister's hand, or leaning against them as if they were all just playing together. These compositions were meant to portray continuity, the idea that even in death, the family unit remained unbroken. The techniques evolved over time. Early daguerreotypes, the first commercially successful photographic process, required very long exposure, sometimes several minutes. This is why people in very old photos often look so stern. They were trying to hold perfectly still. This long exposure time actually made it easier to photograph the dead than the living. A deceased subject, of course, wouldn't move or blink, resulting in a much clearer, sharper image than their living, breathing relatives. Sometimes, the only person in a family photo who is perfectly in focus is the person who has passed away. As technology improved and exposure times got shorter, photographers had to become more creative. They built elaborate posing stands, metal contraptions that could be hidden behind the body to hold it upright. Arms could be bent and fixed in place, and a head clamp could hold the head steady. tilted at a natural angle. It was a strange mix of artistry and engineering, all in service of denying the reality of death. They would even add touches of life after the photo was taken. Rosy tints were often hand-painted onto the cheeks of the corpse in the final print. Sometimes, if the eyes were closed, the photographer or a retoucher would painstakingly paint open eyes directly onto the photograph. The results can be incredibly uncanny. You see a person who is clearly meant to be a part of the scene, but there's just something. Of today, when we stumble across these images, our modern sensibilities are often shocked. We find them morbid, creepy, and unsettling. Our culture has pushed death far into the background. We see it as a medical event that happens in hospitals, something to be sanitized and hidden away. The idea of bringing a deceased family member back into the home, drazined him, and posing them for a photograph seems almost unthinkable. But for our ancestors, death was a constant and very visible part of life. It happened at home, surrounded by family. The rituals of mourning were public and communal. Washing and dressing the body, holding a wake in the parlor, these were all normal parts of the grieving process. The post-mortem photograph was simply an extension of that. It was a way to confront grief head-on, to honor the deceased, and to create a tangible link to the person who was gone. So, what happened? Why did this widespread practice completely disappear by the early 20th century? There were a few key reasons. First, medicine improved dramatically. Child mortality rates began to fall, so the Sudan. Tragic loss of a child became less common. People began to live longer, healthier lives. Death was still a certainty, but it wasn't the constant, lurking presence it had once been. Second, and perhaps most importantly, photography itself changed. With the invention of the Kodak Brownie camera in 1900, photography became accessible and affordable for everyone. Suddenly, you didn't need to hire an expensive professional. People could take their own picture snapshots of birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments. The family album began to fill up with images of life, not death. People now had dozens of photos of their loved ones while they were alive, smiling and vibrant. The need for that one final, somber image faded away. The entire culture around death shifted. As the funeral industry grew, the care of the deceased moved out of the home and into the hands of professionals. The intimate, hands-on grieving process was replaced by a more distant, organized one. We began to fear death, to see it as a failure of medicine rather than a natural part of life. And as that fear grew, the images that reminded us of its reality became taboo. The story of post-mortem photography is more than just a macabre footnote in history. It's a mirror that reflects our own changing relationship with mortality. It forces us to ask some profound questions. What have we lost by sanitizing death, by pushing it out of sight? Our ancestors looked death in the face and tried to capture a piece of it to hold on to. Look, Hawaii. These photographs are a powerful reminder that the way we view the world, and even the end of life itself, is not fixed. It's shaped by our culture, our technology, and our fears. The question isn't just why they did this. The real question is, what does the fact that we find these images so disturbing say about us? What made us forget this practice so completely? And in forgetting, have we also forgotten how to grieve? Next time you're looking through old family photos, look a little closer. You might find a hidden story, a silent figure propped up in a chair, a testament to a time when saying goodbye meant holding on to one last, hauntingly beautiful image. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history. See you next time. Imagine for a moment you reliving in a world where you've never seen your own face. Not really. Maybe you've seen a distorted ripple in a pond or a blurry, dark reflection in a piece of polished metal. But a clear, perfect image of yourself. It doesn't exist. Now, imagine never having a single picture of your mother, your child, your partner. When they're gone, all you have left are your memories, which fade and change over time. This was reality for almost all of human history. Then, in 1839, everything changed. Louis Daguerre introduced his invention, the daguerreotype, to the world. And suddenly, for the first time ever, death could be stopped. Not death itself, but the erasure that came after. The face that would normally fade from memory could now be frozen in silver and glass permanent, unchanging, forever. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more tragique. The mid-19th century was a brutal time to be alive. Cholera swept through cities like an invisible scythe. Tuberculosis, the consumption, consumed entire families. One coughing, blood-spotted victim at a time. Scarlet fever took children by the thousands. Childbirth was a death sentence for countless women. And infant mortality was so common that parents often waited years before even naming their children, afraid to get too attached to someone who probably wouldn't survive. In this world, death wasn't something that happened in a sterile hospital room, handled by professionals and hidden from view. Death happened at home. In the bedroom, into parlor, death was a constant, intimate companion. And into this landscape of loss, photographers arrived like a miracle. But here's the part that most people don't understand. Back then, the dead were often easier to photograph than the living. Early cameras required long exposure times, sometimes several seconds, even minutes. You had to remain absolutely still, or you'd appear as a ghostly blur. Children fidgeted. Adults breathed. Eyes blinked. But the dead were perfect subjects. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They held their poses with an inhuman stillness that the living just couldn't match. In many early family portraits, if you look closely, the dead are actually the clearest, sharpest figures in the frame. In a strange way, they look more present than the living people surrounding them. Photographers learned this quickly, and in an era where a single photograph could cost what a laborer might earn in a week, and most families would only ever own 1 or 2 photographs in their entire lives, a difficult question arose. Should we wait until everyone is alive and healthy, knowing we may never afford another chance? Or should we take the picture now, while we still have something left to remember? The photographers who specialized in this post-mortem work developed techniques that were theatrical, even grotesque. Today, they feel disturbingly close to something out of a horror movie. They weren't just taking pictures of bodies and coffins, though that was the simplest approach, and many families chose it. No, the truly skilled memorial photographers were artists of illusion. They were craftsmen who could make you believe, just for a moment, that the person in the photograph might suddenly draw a breath. They would rush to a family's home within hours of a death, trying to capture the image before the body began to show the unmistakable signs of decay. They brought specialized equipment, hidden stands and frames that could be tucked under clothing, metal clamps to hold a head upright, wires to position arms and hands. They posed the dead in chairs, standing against mantelpieces, or seated at pianos with their fingers resting on the keys. Children were positioned with their favorite toys, as if they had just paused their play for a moment. Mothers were photographed holding their deceased infants, who appeared to be peacefully sleeping in their arms. Entire families gathered around a lost loved one as if they were assembling for any other family portrait, everyone pretending that death was just another guest in the room. The eyes were the hardest part. If you left them open, they had that terrible, glassy stare, the unmistakable emptiness of death. But if you closed them, it looked like sleep, which was better, but it also admitted what everyone was trying to deny. So, photographers got creative. Some specialized in painting pupils directly onto the person's closed eyelids, or onto the photographic plate itself. Others propped the eyelids open with tiny wires or pins, then retouched the images to make the eyes seem alive. Perhaps the most disturbing technique involved taking 2 different photographs, one with the eyes closed, one with the eyes pried open, then cutting and pasting the open eyes onto the final image. This created a chilling hybrid where the dead appeared to be looking directly at the camera, directly at you, from across the gulf of death itself. They would add blush to the cheeks to imitate the flush of life. They positioned bodies near windows to catch the most flattering light. They often photographed the dead alongside the living, and unless you knew what to look for, the too perfect stillness, the slightly odd posture, the subtle wrongness in the eyes, you might not even realize you were looking at a corpse. These photographers were selling comfort. They were selling families the beautiful lie they so desperately wanted to believe, that death was gentle, that death was peaceful, that death was just another kind of sleep from which the beloved might somehow, impossibly, wake up. But why? That's the question that haunts us now. Looking back at these deeply unsettling images, why would anyone want to remember their loved ones this way? Why pose with bodies? Why create these elaborate, theatrical scenes around death? To understand, you have to completely step outside of our modern relationship with mortality and enter a world where death meant something entirely different. In the Victorian era, death wasn't hidden away. There were no funeral homes to whisk the body away. No professionals to handle everything while families grieved at a comfortable distance. When someone died, they died at home. The body was washed and dressed by family members. Mothers prepared their children. Wives prepared their husbands. Daughters prepared their parents. The body would then remain in the home for days, often in the parlor, while family and friends came to pay their last respects. You sat with death. You touched death. You lived with death in your house until the burial. Children grew up understanding mortality not as an abstract concept, but as a physical reality they had witnessed many times. In this context, post-mortem photography wasn't macabre, it was practical, and even seen as beautiful. These photographs served several purposes. First, they were memorial images, often the only photograph a family would ever have of the deceased. For many working-class families who couldn't afford the luxury of regular photos, a death in the family was sometimes the first and only opportunity to capture a person's image. Second, these photos were sent to distant relatives who couldn't attend the funeral. They were a form of visual proof of death, a way to share grief across long distances in a time before telephones and easy travel. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they were tangible objects. They could be held, looked at, kept in a pocket or a locket. They were physical anchors for grief in a world where people understood that memory fades, that faces blur, and that without something concrete to hold on to, the dead eventually vanish completely. But there's something even deeper here. Something about control. Death in the 19th century was random, sudden, and cruel. It took children in the night, mothers in childbirth, strong young men in their prime. People had no control over when or how death would strike, but they could control the memory of death. Through post-mortem photography, they could choose how to remember the departed, not as a body wasted by disease or twisted in pain, but as someone peaceful, dignified, surrounded by family, frozen in a moment that suggested sleep rather than an ending. It was their one small act of defiance against the finality of death. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories. See you next time. Of all the thousands of post-mortem photographs that have survived, certain images stand out, not just for their technical quality or their historical significance, but for the stories they tell and the emotions they still manage to evoke more than a century after they were taken. These aren't just pictures of dead bodies. They're windows into a kind of grief so profound that it transformed entire families, entire communities, entire eras. Consider the sleeping children. There are hundreds of photographs showing infants and young children arranged in their cribs or in small beds, surrounded by flowers, and posed as if they're in a peaceful sleep. Parents chose this illusion very deliberately. They dressed their children in white christening gowns, or their Sunday best. They arranged their small hands so carefully, sometimes folded in prayer, sometimes holding a flower. They desperately wanted to remember their children as angels, as innocent souls who were just resting before heading to heaven. What these images don't show, of course, is what came before. The fever, the desperate midnight runs for doctors who could do nothing, the small body convulsing or struggling to breathe, the exact moment when the child's eyes stopped focusing on their mother's face. The photographs erased all of that suffering, replacing it with a quiet tranquility. It was a mercy, a lie, and an act of incredible love, all at once. Then there are the mother and child portraits, which are perhaps the most heartbreaking of the entire tradition. In some, dead mothers hold living infants who would now have to grow up without them. In others, living mothers hold dead babies they carried for 9 months, felt to move inside them, birthed in agony, and then lost in just hours or days. If you look at these mothers' faces, some of them stare at the camera with an expression of such emptiness that the photograph couldn't fully capture it. Others look down at their dead children with an expression you can't quite read. Is it love? Is it denial? Is it madness? The human face wasn't built to hold that much contradiction. that much impossible emotion all at once. And occasionally, you find photographs that are even more unsettling. Images where the living and the dead are posed together in such a way that it takes you a few seconds to even figure out who has died. A father, a mother, 3 children. Everyone dressed formally, everyone positioned carefully, but one figure is just slightly too still, slightly too perfect. Your eye might pass over them at first, just assuming they were better at holding still for the camera. Then you realize, that isn't stillness. That's death, and everyone else in the photograph knows it. They're sitting there with a corpse, pretending it's a person, because this is the only family portrait they will ever have, and they refuse to exclude the one who just left them. The business of death photography created its own culture, its own economy, and its own specialists. Photographers who built their entire careers around their ability to make the dead look presentable, memorable, almost alive. These weren't your mainstream portrait photographers who were just dabbling in memorial work. These were dedicated professionals who advertised their services, who developed reputations, and who were called upon in the absolute darkest moments of a family's life to perform a very specific kind of magic. The advertisements they placed in newspapers are remarkable documents on their own. Photographing the dead a specialty. Will attend residences day or night. The special attention given to photographing deceased children. These weren't hidden services whispered about in shame. They were openly advertised, publicly acknowledged, and socially acceptable. A good post-mortem photographer was a valuable person in a community, someone you wanted to know about before you needed them. Because when death came and it always cameo wanted to act quickly. The pricing structures revealed just how complex the work was. A simple photograph of a body in a coffin cost less than elaborate poses with the deceased seated or even standing. Photographs that included living family members cost more still. Retouching work like painting eyes to look open, adding color to the cheeks, or removing visible signs of disease or injury added to the price. And rush services, arriving within just a few hours of death, commanded premium rates. Some photographers even offered packages, multiple copies of the same image at a reduced rate, allowing families to send photographs to relatives or keep extras as backups in case the original was damaged. But behind all the business arrangements was genuine skill. These photographers had to work fast, often in very difficult conditions. They were in poorly lit homes, surrounded by grief-stricken families, and dealing with bodies that were they had to be part artist, part psychologist, and part mortician. They had to pose bodies that had gone rigid with rigor mortis, bodies that had begun to settle in ways that nature intended but art required them to correct. They had to work with families who were in shock, often dealing with people who had never even been photographed before and didn't understand the process. People who might break down sobbing in the middle of a session, or who might refuse to believe their loved one was really gone, and they had to get it right the first time. There were no second chances. No calling the family back next week for This was the only opportunity to capture this image. And if the photographer failed, if the camera malfunctioned, if the plate was damaged, if the exposure was wrong, there was no fixing it. The weight of that responsibility must have been absolutely crushing. As we cross into the 20th century, something begins to shift. The photographs change. The practice itself starts to fade away. And in that fading, you can trace the evolution of how Western society relates to death itself, a transformation so complete that by the end of the century, these photographs would seem not just outdated but incomprehensible, almost obscene. The first blow to post-mortem photography was also one of its greatest gifts. Photography became cheaper and more accessible. The Kodak Brownie camera, introduced in 1900, cost just $1 and used roll film that anyone could load and shoot. Suddenly, families could afford to take multiple photographs. You didn't have to wait for death to justify the expense of a portrait anymore. You could photograph birthdays, holidays, ordinary Sundays. Living photographs became common, which meant death photographs became less necessary. If you already had dozens of images of your child smiling, playing, and alive, did you really need one more of them dead? But something deeper was changing. The way Americans and Europeans dealt with death was being systematically professionalized and sanitized. The funeral industry emerged, offering to take care of everything, removing the body from the home, preparing it in special facilities, and returning it in a sealed coffin for brief viewings. Hospitals became the new places of death, replacing the home. Death moved from the family parlor to institutions, from a family responsibility to professional management. And as death moved away from the home, it moved away from everyday life, away from children, and away from open acknowledgement. By the 1920s, the Victorian comfort with death photography was being reframed as morbid, as unhealthy, as something that mentally sound people just didn't do. Psychology was entering popular culture, bringing with it new ideas about grief, trauma, and the proper way to mourn. Looking at photographs of dead loved ones was now considered obsessive, a sign that someone wasn't moving inappropriately. The very same images that Victorian families had treasured began to seem embarrassing, disturbing, something to hide away or throw away entirely. World War I played its part, too, after millions of young men died in trenches, often with no bodies recovered and no photographs possible. The idea of elaborate death rituals for individual people seemed almost quaint. The scale of death had changed. Mass death, industrial death, death without ceremony or dignity, this became the new normal. Individual memorial photographs just couldn't compete with that magnitude of loss. By the 1950s, post-mortem photography had become so rare that most people had never even heard of it. The photographs themselves were being discarded by inheritors who found them disturbing and didn't understand why their grandparents had kept such things. An entire cultural practice, common for nearly a century, was being actively forgotten. Thanks for watching. And if you found this history interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. But the photographs survived. Hidden in attics, stored in boxers, marked old pictures, mixed into family albums where they passed as regular portraits until someone looked closely enough to see the truth. And in recent decades, these images have re-emerged, not as treasured family memories, but as historical curiosities, as dark artifacts that fascinate and repel us in equal measure. The internet brought post-mortem photography back from obscurity. In the early 2000s, collectors and historians began scanning and sharing these images online. Suddenly, thousands of photographs that had been scattered across attics and antique shops were available to anyone with an internet connection. People started collecting them, not as memorials, but as examples of Victorian culture, as evidence of how radically our relationship with death has changed. Museums created exhibits, books were published, and with each article, each gallery, each discussion thread, the same reaction. This is so disturbing. Why would anyone do this? How could they bear it? But here's what's fascinating. We're disturbed by the wrong things. We look at these photographs and think we're upset by the presence of death, by seeing corpses, by the idea of posing with dead bodies. But that's not really what bothers us. What bothers us is the intimacy with death. It's not the body itself, but the closeness to it, the touching, the arranging, the sitting beside it for the length of a photographic exposure. We've built such a powerful wall between ourselves and death, but seeing it breached, seeing people in regular clothes, in home settings, calmly interacting with corpses, is what truly unsettles us. Consider this. We see images of death constantly. News, photographs of disaster victims, crime scenes, war zones. Movies show us death in graphic detail, and we watch for entertainment. But those deaths are distant, abstract, not ours. The people dying are strangers, actors, pixels on a screen. Post-mortem photographs are different because they're domestic, familial, intimate. They show us death in the home, death in the family. Death is something that happens to people like us, that we might have to touch and handle and sit beside. That's the real horror for modern viewers. Not death itself, but the possibility that death might come back into our homes. Our lives, our physical reality in a way we can't maintain a comfortable distance from. And there's something else worth considering. We've developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms to avoid saying dead. People pass away, are lost, go to a better place, move on. We talk about death in the passive voice, as if it's something that happens vaguely and abstractly. But Victorian post-mortem photographs are aggressively honest. Here's a body. Here's a dead person. Here is what death looks like. No euphemisms, no distance, no pretense. Maybe that directness is what really disturbs us. Now, we need to address something uncomfortable. Many of the post-mortem photographs circulating online Are UNT actually post-mortem photographs at all? There's a mythology that's grown up around these images, a set of false beliefs that have become so widespread they're accepted as fact, even though historians and photography experts have debunked them repeatedly. The most common myth is that you can identify a dead person in a Victorian photograph by finding the clearest, sharpest figure, the person who looks most focused, most still. The logic seems sound. The dead don't move, so they'd be clearer than living subjects who might have shifted during the long exposure times. But this is backwards. Yes, exposure times were long in the early days of photography, but by the 1860s and 70s, the peak era of post-mortem photography, exposure times had shortened dramatically. Living people could hold still for the second or two required for a clear image. The idea that Victorian families routinely included dead people in portraits and posed them as if alive is largely exaggerated. Most genuine post-mortem photographs are obvious. The deceased is clearly deceased, lying in a coffin, arranged on a bed, eyes closed, positioned in ways that acknowledge death rather than denying it. The elaborate standing poses, the dead people with open eyes painted on, the corpses at pianos. These existed, but they were rare, expensive, technically difficult, and usually only attempted with very recently deceased individuals, often children, where the body was still flexible enough to position. So why does the mythology persist? Partly because it makes a better story. The idea of hidden death of corpses secretly present in old family portraits is more disturbing, and therefore more shareable than the reality that most death photographs are exactly what they appear to be. Formal memorial portraits of bodies and coffins. We want the unsettling detail, the secret knowledge that lets us look at an old photograph and think maybe that person is dead. It's the same impulse that drives people to believe every old photograph with someone looking stiff or strange must be a post-mortem image. But there's also a commercial element. Online sellers of antique photographs realized years ago that labeling something as a Victorian post-mortem photograph dramatically increases its value. So suddenly, thousands of ordinary portraits of living people, people who maybe looked a bit stern or held very still or had pale skin, were being sold as death portraits. The market incentivized false identification, and the mythology spread. The real post-mortem photographs are powerful enough without embellishment. We don't need to imagine hidden corpses in every Victorian portrait to understand that these people had a fundamentally different relationship with death than we do. Let's talk about what happens to grief when you can photograph it. Because that's really what post-mortem photography was. Not just photographing bodies, but attempting to capture and preserve grief itself, to create a physical object that could hold and contain the overwhelming emotions that death brings. Grief in the 19th century was a public, structured, highly ritualized experience. There were rules for mourning. How long you wore black, when you could return to society, what jewelry was appropriate, how you decorated your home. These weren't arbitrary traditions. They were frameworks that helped people navigate devastating loss in an era when death was constant and overwhelming. The rituals gave grief a shape, a timeline, a socially acceptable form of expression. Post-mortem photography fit perfectly into this structure. The photograph became a mourning object, like black crepe or mourning jewelry made from the deceased's hair. But it was more powerful than those objects, because it held the actual image, the face, the specific physical reality of the person who was gone. You could look at it when grief felt abstract and remember exactly who you'd lost. You could show it to children who were too young to remember and say, "This was your sister. This is who we lost." You could send it to relatives and say, "This is how we said goodbye." But photographs also do something strange to memory. They freeze Italiano. Before photography, memories of the dead evolved over time. Faces softened in recollection. Painful details faded. The story you told yourself about who they were could change as you changed. But a photograph doesn't evolve. It's static, permanent, unchanging. The dead person remains exactly as they were at the moment the shutter clicked, while everyone else ages, changes, and moves forward through time. In a way, post-mortem photographs created a new kind of haunting, not by ghosts, but by images, by frozen moments that never age, never change, never let you forget exactly how things were. And there's a paradox here. These photographs, were meant to provide comfort, to preserve memory, to help people grieve. But did they help? Or did they make grief harder by providing a permanent image of death that couldn't fade naturally, that couldn't be softened by time? We don't really know. The Victorians didn't have the psychological frameworks to analyze it, and by the time psychology developed those frameworks, the practice was dying out. What we do know is that people treasured these photographs intensely. They were kept close, looked at frequently, and shown to others. Whether that was healthy or helpful by modern standards is perhaps irrelevant. It's what people needed at the time. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one. Here's what might be the most disturbing thought of all. We still do this. We've never stopped. We've just changed the medium and convinced ourselves it's different. Think about how death appears in our current media landscape. We photograph the scenes of accidents, the flowers left at tragedy sites, the makeshift memorials. We post about deceased loved ones on social media, often using their photographs, sharing memories, creating digital monuments. We keep their profiles active, sometimes forever, creating strange ghost accounts where people post birthday wishes to the dead, where the deceased's final posts remain frozen in the timeline like digital tombstones. When celebrities die, we share their images everywhere, not photos of their bodies. No, but photos of them alive. Photos that remind us what we've lost. We create tribute videos, compilation images, memorial posts that circulate across platforms. We're doing exactly what the Victorians did, trying to use visual media to preserve memory, to make death somehow less final, to create objects that let us hold on to what's gone. The difference is the distance. Victorian post-mortem photographs were intimate, physical, personal. They showed body. They acknowledged death directly. Our memorial posts are sanitized, distanced, acceptable. We share images of life to memorialize death. We crop out the coffin, the hospital room, the actual moment of ending. We've found ways to memorialize that don't require us to confront physical death, that let us grieve without ever having to look directly at what we've lost. But is our way better? We've gained comfort, distance, the ability to avoid confronting the physical reality of death. But we've lost something too. Maybe honesty, maybe acceptance, maybe a kind of courage that came from being willing to sit beside the body, to touch it, to acknowledge that this is what death looks like, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. And here's something else. Victorian post-mortem photographs were taken once, and then the body was buried. The photograph existed, but the body was gone. Today, images never die. They circulate indefinitely, copied endlessly, appearing and reappearing, searchable forever. In a strange way, we've created something more permanent than Victorian death photographs: digital immortality, where images and posts and profiles persist long after the physical body is gone, where you can Google someone else's name and find their entire life spread out in photographs and posts and comments. A kind of haunting that the Victorians couldn't have imagined. We look back at Victorian post-mortem photography with judgment, with disgust, with fascination, thinking we're so much more enlightened now. But maybe we're just different. Maybe every era finds its own ways to deny death, to preserve memory, to pretend that the people we love don't really leave us. The Victorians used cameras and corpses. We use smartphones and social media. The tools change. The need doesn't. So what do we do with this knowledge? What does it mean that this practice existed, that it was normal, that thousands of these photographs still exist in attics and albums and online archives? What does it mean that we find them so disturbing? Maybe it means we need to reconsider our relationship with death itself. We've built such an elaborate structure of denial. Death happens in hospitals and nursing homes, handled by professionals, kept at arm's length from daily life. We say people passed away instead of died. We have a closed casket funerals where the body is hidden, or cremations where the body disappears entirely into ash. We've made death invisible, abstract, something that happens somewhere else to other people. The Victorians couldn't afford that luxury. Death was too present, too constant, too unavoidable. So they developed rituals and practices that helped them face it directly: mourning clothes, elaborate funerals, mourning jewelry, and yes, Post-mortem photographs. They didn't deny death, they integrated it into life. They made space for it in their homes, their families, their daily routines. Children grew up understanding that death was part of existence, not some terrible aberration that only happened occasionally and should be hidden away. There's something we can learn from that, even if we don't want to return to photographing corpses. Maybe it's simply this. Death is real. Los is real. Grief is real. And pretending otherwise, hiding, why, treating it as somehow improper or morbid to acknowledge that, doesn't make it easier. It just makes it more terrifying when it finally comes for someone you love. Post-mortem photography was many things a memorial practice, a business, an art form, a psychological coping mechanism. But at its core, it was an acknowledgement that death happens, that people you love will die, that you will die, and that there is no shame in looking directly at that reality and finding ways to make it bearable. When you look at those old photographs, now the children arranged in beds, the mothers holding infants, the families gathered around their dead, try to see past the strangeness, past the discomfort. Try to see the love, because that is what these images really are. Proof that people loved so much they could unbear to let go completely, that they were willing to do this uncomfortable, intimate, difficult thing to preserve one final moment together. And maybe centuries from now, when our descendants look back at our digital memorials, our social media posts, our ways of dealing with death, they'll find us just as strange, just as disturbing, just as incomprehensible. They'll wonder why we did things the way we did, what we were thinking, what we were trying to accomplish. And maybe someone will make a video about us trying to understand the bizarre death practices of the early 21st century, trying to explain to a future audience why we believed the things we believed and feared the things we feared. Every era. Guess the death practices it needs. The Victorians needed photographs. We need digital immortality. Future generations will need something we can't even imagine yet. But underneath all of it, the cameras, the pixels, the fear, the denial is the same thing. Love. And the desperate, impossible desire to make that love last beyond death itself. That's what these photographs show us. That's what they've always shown us. If you can look past the bodies and the strangeness and the distance of time, that's what you'll see. People who loved so much, they tried to photograph death itself, hoping to prove that love was stronger.